Hello everyone. In this video I'm going to take a close look at two of Emily Dickinson's poems, Wild Nights, and Faith is a Fine Invention. I'm going to close read these poems, and that's where I'm going to spend most of the time for these. So first I'm going to close read the poems, and then I'll give you a little bit of relevant historical background. But most of this video is going to revolve around looking at what we can actually see in the text itself. So I'm going to start here with Wild Nights. Okay, so the first line of this poem, Wild Nights. If I'm going to mark this, if I'm going to perform some scansion, I'm thinking this looks like 4 syllables in a row, and it looks like each one of them is getting its emphasis. So you can't really say that this is a trochee or an iamb or anything like that. It's Wild Nights. Just bam, 4 hard beats in a row. And we would call those spondees. So this is spondaic to begin with. I'll write that right here. So that's spondaic structure at the very beginning. But it's 4 syllables. It looks like it's going to set up some kind of dimeter. I doubt she's going to go with spondees the entire time. So the next line, so Wild Nights. We were setting up with an exclamation point. We have a hyphen in the middle here, or an M dash. Okay, not much, the repetition. All right, there's some, just pointing out poetic devices as I see, and we have some repetition of the phrases there. All right, were I with thee. It looks like it's going to be were I with thee. So this is going to be an iamb, very traditional. And there's 2 of them. So that's going to be iambic dimeter. Okay, Wild Nights, were I with thee. Wild Nights. I don't know if that's, 2 spondees or, maybe, I think with Dickinson, you got to keep in mind she can be a little bit, she'll play with these meters and rhythms a little bit more and not necessarily be terribly strict, but that's not laziness. A lot of times it's done for effect. But I don't want to bring in too much outside knowledge to this. Right now I'm looking at the poem for just what it is, what it presents to me just on the page. So Wild Nights is kind of how I'm reading this. I've got a couple spondees and a trochee or an iamb again. Our luxury. So I think that's going to be our luxury, the continuation of the iambic diameter. So we've basically got, 4 syllables, 4 lines. So we got 3 quatrains here. This whole thing here, we're going to might as well write that down. Keep all of our poetry terminology straight. Looks like she's setting up 3 quatrains, and they are going to be in something like an iambic dimeter. All right. Wild Nights, were I with thee. Wild Nights should be our luxury. All right, we would take our time. We would have a lot of fun. Okay, that's basically how she's setting things up. Futile the winds. All right, so I feel like that's going to get pronounced futile the winds. And we have this kind of almost chiasmic. I think there's a better word for that in this case. It's a trochee at the beginning here. So now we've got a trochee that goes into an iamb. The next line is, I'm going to read this as to a heart in port. So it's futile the winds, dot 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 dot. So dot dot dot. That's basically the iambic dimeter, but she's starting it. She's keeping that dimeter feel by using what's called an anapest here. So there's still 2 feet. There's an anapest and an iamb to create this dimeter. Still got the almost iambic dimeter feel by using this anapest here. But then she switches from an anapest to a dactyl. Done with the compass. done with the chart. So with the last line, we get that dot, 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 dot that we had in the beginning, which feels like a dactyl, which is definitely what she's using here, except that she couples that. So let me write that here for us. That's a dactyl. And she's coupling that with a trochee, right? Dot, 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 dot. Again, she's playing with this a little bit, giving us essentially 4 syllables. It's really 5. But those 2 feet, it's still keeping that diameter. Done with the chart, so that's just like that first line where there's a trochee that ends in an IM, so it dot, 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 dot. All right, so next line, a feudal the winds to a heart in port. What does that mean? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how windy it is. It doesn't matter what the weather is. If I'm in port and I need to get out there, I'm done with the compass, done with the chart, I'm going. You know, I don't need directions. I know how to get there. The wind isn't going to tell me how to get there. Rowing in Eden. I'm going to stress that. Rowing in Eden. So she's doing the same thing here. There's a dactyl. Dot, 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 dot. You know, rowing in Eden. She's got a dactyl and a trochee. Ah. And then there's something really interesting here. Rowing in Eden. And she feels like she's setting up that dot, 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 dot. That's her rhythm throughout. Ah. Then there's just a pause. Now, we've got hyphens or em dashes, you know, in other spots, and she uses them a lot at the end of the line. And so that pause is kind of naturally felt here. And in the middle, we just kind of roll through it. But here I feel like we've only got 3 syllables, and I think her rest is intentional. I think that's a rest. So I'm going to read that as if it's a syllable, which I realize it's not. It's not even a word. But she did put a punctuation mark there for some reason. And she does it again in the next line. Might I but more. So that looks like, if we're following the same rhythm she's established, if you're not sure whether to put the emphasis on might or I don't think she's going with might I. You know, I think it's might I but more. It's that same thing. Dot, 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 dot. And so that would be the end of that line. That's the 4 syllables that she's got. And then she makes us hang on a little bit and gives us like an echo of it. Tonight. It ends with another iamb. And then another line. In thee. Just by itself. Right? So lots of interesting devices here. I want to also point out that it's kind of... She does use a chiasmic structure. At least that's what I'm seeing, because she opens this with "were I with thee," and she ends it with the "I in thee" as well. This is the bookend. Were I with thee, all these things would happen. Blah 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 blah. If I could be with thee, so it opens and closes with the same ideas. She keeps it. This is one of the things I find really interesting about her work. But again, I don't want to drag in other Emily Dickinson works. What she has done here is give us very interesting takes on dimeter. She's established her own rhythm throughout. She has this nautical imagery where she's talking about, you know, using a compass and a chart and sailing and rowing in Eden. She's got this biblical imagery here. Then obviously Eden is the Garden of Eden is what she's referring to, and that's the garden at the beginning of time in the Christian religion, where Adam and Eve would have been. So it's not only a very sacred kind of place. It's a heavenly, a utopic place. It's also a romantic place in sorts. It's the first couple, right? And I suppose that'll get us into, you know, some of the outside of the text readings and some of the contextual readings and historical readings. So I don't need to get into who the other half of this is. So that's for another video. That's for another section. But for here, what we have is, you know, a heightened relationship, a pure in Edenic, right? It's pure because it's like the very, very first one. And it's utopic. It's in a garden. It's in a paradise. Everything is provided for them. Okay. So, lovely poem. Very romantic, lots of passion, lots of wonderful poetic devices. lots to be said about this one. And hopefully all of these terms will help you can apply them to other Dickinson poems. Hey, so I realized I forgot something pretty important in my scansion here, which was rhyme scheme. I went through everything else and I didn't talk about rhyme scheme. Rhyme scheme. We have a rhyme scream. I got Halloween on my mind, I guess. We have 3 quatrains here, but I didn't talk about the rhymes. So nights, the, be, e. We got 3 in a row here, although one of them might not necessarily go, but I'm going to say they all match. So our rhyme scheme to start here is wild nights. A, B rhymes with the being luxury. So A, B, B, B. Feudal the winds to a heart and port. Done with the compass, done with the chart. All right, so I'm going to call winds C. Port is D. Compass is going to be, looks like E. I don't think compass and winds really rhyme. But port and chart, I'm going to say do rhyme. I think she's using, I heard some slant rhyme there. They rhyme close enough for me. So it looks like she's going with B and B. Her second and fourth is what she wants to rhyme, and it might be just a coincidence on the third one in that first quatrain. Rowing in Eden, so now we are at F. The C, we're back to that original one. Okay, B. Might I bet more tonight, G. In thee. So, I'm really glad that I came back to this and reminded myself to look at the rhyme scheme, because this rhyme scheme here, the second and fourth lines rhyming, and the second and fourth lines rhyming here, second and fourth line rhyming here, this rhyme scheme with the B's being in the first and the last matches that observation I had earlier about the overall chiasmic structure that this poem has. The I with thee is the first 2 lines, and I with thee is the last 2 lines. And B and B, the second and fourth lines rhyme here, the second and fourth lines rhyme here. There's a different second and fourth lines rhyme here, but they don't rhyme with the first and last quatrain here. So there you go. One last little part that I forgot to add on. I'm glad I came back and added it on, because we can see that this is what makes Emily Dickinson to me so awesome. Is it's so simple, yet it all has meaning. It's not, none of it is a throwaway, even if it is reusing so many traditional ideas. She reuses them meaningfully. Okay, so now that we've read Wild Nights, and we see that it's a devotional, a love poem, the most common question I get from people then is, well, who is it to? And more specifically, people want to know, was Emily Dickinson gay, or was Emily Dickinson a lesbian? The answer to that is most certainly yes, if you ask me, but it is actually debatable among some scholars, and I understand that to even say that it is debatable feels like a sort of a cop out, or a like taking a stand, because the argument about whether or not she had certain relationships with specific people is often imbued with certain political ideologies, and I'm not trying to stress anything like that. In fact, for a good look at the just an overview of the research on her sexuality, you could look at the online publication Gaiety, which describes itself as producing LGBTQ plus content that entertains, educates, and inspires joy. And even in their conclusion to their essay on their article on Emily Dickinson's sexuality, they state that while it's difficult to say whether Dickinson was gay for sure, there is a lot we do know. She has had more than one close relationship with women throughout her lifetime. Despite attempts to stamp out these details, recent evidence tells us that she wasn't as straight as some historians suggest. So, they offer a little bit of wiggle room, but they're pretty much where I am, which is that, yes, she most certainly had romantic relationships with women. There is a recently discovered daguerreotype of her and Kate Scott Turner, and this is significant. This appears to be her in the in the daguerreotype with Kate Scott Turner. She's on the left. Kate Scott Turner is on the right. This is significant. This was taken when the poet was probably 30, and the Kate Scott Turner went on to live in Europe years later and openly gay. So there's that connection that leads people to believe that maybe they had a relationship. There's also just a very explicit relationship that she had with her sister-in-law, Susan Gilbert, and this is the one that most people are familiar with. In fact, Susan Gilbert's daughter wrote in the preface to The Single Hound, which is a collection of Emily Dickinson's works. In the preface to that collection, Susan Gilbert's daughter wrote, "The romantic friendship of my Aunt Emily Dickinson and her sister Sue extended from girlhood until death. The first poem, dated, was sent in 1848, and probably the last word Aunt Emily ever wrote was her reply to a message from my mother. My answer is an unmitigated yes, Sue. During the last year of my mother's life, she read and reread these poems and innumerable letters with increasing indecision as to the final disposition of her treasury. It eventually devolved upon me to choose between burning them or giving them to the lovers of my aunt's peculiar genius." So thankfully she did not burn them. She held on to them and were actually able to see them. But they were doctored a number of times by a number of people for various reasons. So the evidence seems pretty clear. She had several romantic relationships with women, and one of them was apparently the most significant relationship of her life. She did have relationships with men, and so I am not an expert on sexuality. I'm not going to try to pin down her sexuality as that means that she's this or that. She's certainly, the love of her life appears to have been Susan Gilbert, her sister-in-law, whom she met and began corresponding with through letters when she was 19 until the end of her life. She also had a relationship, possibly, some kind of relationship with Kate Scott Turner. She had relationships with several men. The last relationship of her life officially was her engagement to Judge Otis Lord, who is a distant relative of mine, his great, so here's my bias, just going to put my cards on the table. He is his great-great-grandfather, I believe, is my 6th or 7th grandfather, so we're kind of connected. That doesn't mean I'm just going to make up things out of whole cloth. He's also mentioned in that letter that Susan Gilbert's daughter wrote in the preface to those poems. Of course, he's mentioned in a story from when Emily Dickinson was younger, because he is of her father's generation. In fact, they didn't marry. Their engagement didn't become a marriage because he died. She died only a few years later, too. So that's a very brief synopsis of her love life. The last thing that I would argue is well, what does all this really have to do? If love is love, why does it matter? And I would argue that it probably doesn't really matter that much, except for maybe that one line, rowing in Eden, because of the biblical allusion and because of the obvious problems that the Christian faith or the Christian religion has with homosexuality and the gay and lesbian community. More importantly, because she would not have been able to live openly as a result of Christian culture, that line then might take on a different resonance. So that's the only thing that that's where I feel like giving this some context maybe does put a different spin on the poem. I don't think it changes it entirely. I think it just gives it a little bit of an extra layer, just a little. And I think you can even look at it without that layer and it still works. I think she can mean it both ways. I don't think she needs to necessarily be subverting that idea. She could just be working with a trope that she knows well, just an image that she knows well, the Garden of Eden. Okay, so I've already performed the scansion here. I've already placed down my marks, so I'm just going to read through and show you what I've done here. she's starting with 7 syllables. So faith is a fine invention. It's kind of hard to break down exactly what the meter is. This would be called a septenary, sept meaning 7. So there's 7 syllables here. It means, kind of resists any specific trimeter or anything else, 7 being a prime number, right? It's kind of hard to divide it to anything. So we have faith is we're starting with a dactyl. And then fine invention. Actually, I think I thought about this before. It's not starting with a dactyl. It's actually doing something very familiar. She's starting with a trochee and then an iamb. So dot 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 dot. She's starting with a trochee coupled with an iamb, and then she's going to finish off her third foot in this one is going to be an amphibrach. Invention. That's when you've got an unstressed syllable, a stressed syllable, and an unstressed syllable. Those 3 together create 1 foot. That's how I'm reading this, and so I'm going to call this an amphibrach. So a trochee, an iamb, and an amphibrach. It's basically 3 feet, and that seems to match up with the second and fourth lines, which are going to both be iambic trimeter. For gentlemen who see, and that's a really ugly reading of it, but that tells you where the stress goes, right? For gentlemen who see, that's how you actually read it. So for gentlemen who see, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, very, very common. Iambic, there's 3 of them, trimeter. Unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, another amphibrach, but microscopes are prudent. That's how I'm reading that, but microscopes are prudent. That's going to give me that 2 trochees, 2 iambs, followed by an amphibrach. So different from the first line, which was a trochee, an iamb, and an amphibrach. This is 2 iambs and an amphibrach. It's a little bit more sing-song than the first one, although the whole thing together gives it a little bit more of that sing-song feel. And an emergency. So now she's back to that septenary. She's got in an Oh, actually, no, I'm sorry. That is the trimeter. I skipped it, but microscopes are prudent is the one with the dactyl. That's the septenary. In an emergency. Okay. Not too much more to say here. There's just 4 lines, so just 1 quatrain. That's what she's made for us here. She's got a little bit of repetition, some consonants. Faith is a fine invention for gentlemen who there it is again. For gentlemen who see, but microscopes are prudent and an emergency. It's not too much other. Obviously, her rhyme here, C and C. I don't believe I even talked about that in the other close reading that I talked about. Invention and prudent don't really match, so I suppose if I was going to give this a rhyme scheme, it would be A, B, C, B, right? So faith is a fine invention. All right, we've got the rhyme scheme. We've got something of a meter. It looks like something like an iambic trimeter throughout. It's a quatrain. What is it saying? Well, faith is a fine invention. Ooh, that what does that mean? Like, how is she using the word invention there? Something that was just created then, as in it's false? Or it is fine, she says. For gentlemen who see, she has it in italics. I've used green here to indicate those are italicized in her version. Okay, I don't know what the italics mean. Is that like sarcasm? Or is it saying that there's some other type of sight? Is it giving credit to that? But microscopes are prudent, so that's what's wise. Microscopes. And here, microscope, she's using what's called, I believe this is an example of metonymy, where she's using one thing to stand for everything else. Pardon me. Excuse me. Microscopes are something used in science, so microscopes stand for all of science. Faith stands for all of religion. It's kind of an argument about faith versus, or religion versus science. Although, not to get too intertextual, I don't want to get too outside of this poem. Her own beliefs on faith are pretty complex. This one seems to simplify it, although I think there might be more complexity to it than at first glance. Than our first scan shows me. But I'm just going to go with my hot take for now, which is that she seems to prefer science. She seems to say, yes, I appreciate the prayers, but I would also like the surgery. And if I have to choose, I think I'll take the surgery first. That seems to be her claim, that this is the smarter way to go, that this is a little bit more material, that we live in a material world. And I don't think that she has very necessarily, I think it would therefore be a mistake to think that she is just a materialist. She's deeply spiritual. I think she's just aware that we do live in a material world. Okay, now that we've read Faith is a Fine Invention, let's look at some of the actual biographical information about Emily Dickinson and seeing how that's relevant. We've already seen how the poem is comparing science and religion and favoring science, microscopes, over faith. So what do we know about Emily Dickinson's actual religious upbringing? We know that she was raised in a Calvinist family. She was raised in New England during a period of religious revivals. In fact, during her teen years, one of the things we know is that, according to the Emily Dickinson Museum website, in Dickinson's teen years, a wave of religious revivals moved through New England. One by one, her friends and family members made the public profession of belief in Christ that was necessary to become a full member of the church. Although she agonized over her relationship to God, Dickinson ultimately did not join the church. So we know that she was not swayed by these religious revivals, although she did have a keen interest in spiritual matters. We see that throughout her poems. She displays God in a number of ways, as being not there, as being violent, very often violent and awesome in the old sense of the word awesome, as an awe-inspiring, and like the way a thundercloud on the horizon is awesome. So she has what I think might best be described as a almost deist, but more like transcendentalist view of God. It's informed to some degree by Christianity, but though she's very familiar with the Bible, I would hesitate to call her a Christian. Perhaps Christian transcendentalist. I don't think she's rejecting the message of the New Testament so much as rejecting the religions that it's based on. So that's all I have to offer there. If you want to look at more, I'm going to put a link to the museum's website, and they've got a few more links that you can check out for more information on Emily Dickinson and her faith.